As the day-to-day goes along, you find yourself in conversations about perspective. And the perspective is that since we have cloud instances and cloud services, when can we get rid or when can we move on from the on-premise activity that we have going on? So it's almost a concern to bring up Active Directory still exists in some conversations.
What do you tell them?
Right. So, I try not to cry.
Mobile workforces, cloud applications, and digitalization are changing every aspect of the modern enterprise. And with radical transformation come new business risks. Welcome to Hybrid Identity Protection, the premier podcast for cybersecurity pros charged with defending hybrid identity environments. Presented by Semperis, the pioneers of identity-driven cyber resilience for the hybrid enterprise. And now, here's your host, 15-time Microsoft MVP and Active Directory security expert, Sean Deuby.
Welcome. You're listening to the Hybrid Identity Protection Podcast. We just call it the HIP Podcast, the premier podcast for identity-centric cybersecurity pros, presented by Semperis. Today, we're here with Andrew Cedergren, Senior Security Engineer Lead for Identity and Access Management for Delta Airlines.
Hi. Hello, Sean. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you here.
It's fantastic.
You, at the Hybrid Identity Protection Conference, the tech day that we had in Atlanta a little while ago, you gave a talk about identity lifecycle and identity lifecycle security.
Yes.
And how to secure identities. Do you want to first, tell me a bit about what you do in your day job, and then tell me what you talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. From a day-to-day focus in identity and access management, it's really combining the fundamentals, and the fundamentals to me wrap around directory security, availability, and bringing that from on-premise into our cloud instances, right, across multiple stages. And what I mean by stages is from the time an identity is provisioned to its lifespan, potential changes that occur in there, then also where it's utilized. And that can be inside four walls in a corporate network, or used outside, right, coming in from the external aspect. And experience throughout my consulting career brings that from travel and tourism into e-commerce, and healthcare, from small to mid-sized business to large to enterprise organizations.
Right. So you're talking about the whole the CRUD acronym: create, read, update, delete.
Perfect. And that's how it makes you feel sometimes. It's really...
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
And so this is about, as you were saying, for most organizations are hybrid. Mm-hmm. And most organizations' identity, if not all of it, most of it that they have in the cloud originate on premises.
Correct. Yes.
And you're talking about where it originates.
Yes, absolutely.
At the spring, as it were.
Yeah, because as the day-to-day goes along, you find yourself in conversations about perspective. And the perspective is that since we have cloud instances and cloud services, when can we get rid or when can we move on from the on-premise activity that we have going on? So it's almost a concern to bring up Active Directory still exists in some conversations.
What do you tell them when they ask that question?
Right. So, I try not to cry. It's more of an emotional response than a business response. I mix emotions in the industry. So what I tell them is none of this actually occurs without that. Okay. And the basics being that from identity and when an account can be created, take into consideration that we still have Active Directory, we still have Active Directory administrators, engineers, and now we're introducing identity platforms across the enterprises. We're introducing privileged access management and vaulting solutions in enterprises. All of these commingle and they have to get along. And from an identity and directory perspective, you start to see a separation as time goes along. Okay. And the concern there is that if identity operates in a silo and directory operates in a silo, you have a scenario like in the movie Predator when Arnold Schwarzenegger encounters the Predator and they both ask the question, who are you, to one another. That's how it feels on the directory side when an account comes along. That doesn't match how an identity should be provisioned. And that's really the crux of it, is building that partnership from directory to identity that can stabilize the fundamentals. And the fundamentals still revolve around properties that can be set on accounts, attributes that can be populated on accounts. Those same items from on-premise can be consumed by your cloud services and their provider.
Right, like a dynamic group that's built in Azure Active Directory that relies on attributes that you have from on-premise.
Absolutely.
And if that's not right, at the wellspring, as it were, and then it goes from there.
Correct, yeah. And those items, believe it or not, can be a miss between what the identity team is doing and what the expectations of the control is from an information security compliance standpoint. So if you talk about the examples of multi-factor authentication, there's even continued push for FIDO2 and security key authentication. From both services, AWS, you can apply UTF keys, right, to meet some of the needs from a biometric key standpoint. From an Azure Active Directory side, you can do the same thing. You can you can enroll groups of people or groups of users in these authentication protocols. Those controls are what's a concern, because the identity team still is worried about what's coming from our data source. Is our data source HR, right? How valid is that data, and what is an account that they need? But what gets amiss there is they need one account, they need another one, they're also an IT administrator, they're also a domain administrator, they're also a customer, they're also a retiree, they're also a contractor. Those kind of components that play into the persona of the identity, and the additional controls you can actually put in place with the basics, attributes and properties.
You bring up a good point, which is that it's easy to think of the source of Active Directory, the source of truth, as it were, as being HR, but there are many different personas beyond the basic employee, FTE, or vendor identity that comes out of there. There is, as you say, there is the administrative account, which never shows up in HR.
Correct.
There is the external, there's the B2B guest account.
Yep.
There is the, as we're seeing increasingly in the enterprise, especially in the hybrid enterprise, we're increasingly seeing the personal account.
Yep.
The Microsoft account or the Gmail account being used to access corporate resources.
Yeah, spot on. One of the gaps that you try to bridge over is that depending on the maturity of your identity platform, your processes and services, right? You take a step back and you can laugh about that. Right now, our identity provisioning and our directory management, right? 9 out of 10 people could look around the room and say, right now, yeah, it's our process that we operate upon is SPSS as an acronym, right? Some people and some scripts, right? That's what we have as our control. And with that frame of mind, the one component that I always operate on is it's actually a reminder that on the dashboard when your car says change oil soon, right? It's not a check engine, okay? So we're going to keep going, right? We're going to keep that in the back of our mind. And if you operate that you can improve these items as time goes along, and then take a step back and start to look at how mature your identity provisioning platform is, you can bring that awareness to your identity team that says, from these controls, did you know that we have cloud native services? You had mentioned B2B, Sean, and guest users as an example. You can actually mature your identity platform to reach out to your cloud provider, your cloud service, attestate and aggregate and actually bring in the list of users into your internal identity platform. Now, depending on how mature or how crazy you want to get at that point, you could do relationships based on the schema that you have defined in your identity system, right? Because there's schemas. We say schema, we think Active Directory and forest level schemas. Within an identity platform, you can also have a schema that builds relationships and levels to accounts and a persona and what exists for roles and accounts for an individual.
So what recommendations do you have for, I don't know if we want to call it easy wins or, if you had to have, someone had to start somewhere, and your strongest recommendations, what would they be?
Yep. The strongest recommendations would be that bring the directory team, individual, Active Directory. You can have a virtual directory, right? You can have an ODSE, Oracle directory. You can have other directories, right? And keep in mind the target systems that we provision to within identity are not just an Active Directory, right? To build upon that a little bit, don't forget about mainframe and other capabilities. These all have the same relationships, right? There's fundamental attributes and properties associated with each account in these specific instances. And so where to start is bridge that gap back from directory and provision accounts from what we know about directory, bring that to the identity team, and make them understand, right, in partnership, that here's the critical nature of how we can use attributes and properties across all of these targets to control the identity through its entire lifespan. And provisioning with those from inception, right, from the time that they begin, is what eases the burden. And it is a reality that the identity team is not a directory team, right? If you understand that as a step one and do not assume, the assumptions is what is difficult to overcome.
That sounds like a lot of it is organizational also, though, because your stakeholders are all across the company. There's the Active Directory team, there's the IAM team, there's the HR team, there's the mainframe team, there's all of the application owners that need identities provisioned into their application.
Correct.
Via your IAM system. So you have to understand what all of their requirements, or at least most of their requirements, are to understand how the identity should be formed.
Correct. Yep. And one of the controls that you can wrap around that, rather outside of getting into the HRIT, to identity provisioning, to directory conversation, go up to one other layer, right? Away from the source of truth, go more downstream and understand the services layers and access into those downstream targets. So one example is when we start talking about federated authentication, right? And the controls that we can wrap around that. Think about your federation provider and the services layer that you can provide for an enterprise, both internally and externally. And the same requirements that allow an identity to be provisioned, if you take into consideration the basics of populating attributes a certain way, setting properties a certain way, you can wrap those into a federated provider authentication policy and other controls where you, from the HRIT and identity services platform all the way out to the user experience in their authentication, you can tie back all of those values and scope out authentication policies at the services layer prior to the individual accessing application. So you can again build upon that experience to say, we, Sean, as a user, for example, we provisioned him. He's an employee. He's here, but he also has an IT admin account. Okay, if you have a standard adoption across an organization that's understood as an authentication pattern, here's how we consume authentication services. Wrap authentication and authorization policies in at that layer. Look for the attributes that you set at the time of provisioning that have been agreed upon between HR and your identity provisioning team that you aided from the directory side to build, and those authentication policies change and control that experience. If you use your IT administrator account to log on to an application, I built in a policy control around that. You can't use that account type. And the account type, again, you start building on those attributes. That's how you start to understand it if an account looks real in your environment, because taking into consideration that authentication services layer, and if you have multiple accounts with properties set a certain way, attributes a certain way, and you have authentication and authorization controls built in, if I sneak into your environment and create an account, I might not know about these extended attributes you have. I might not know about these properties, okay? And so the example would be if I create an account in your Active Directory, but I don't populate an attribute a certain way, I have authentication controls at that layer that doesn't allow any authentication to occur because you don't have values that I've created in a policy.
It's non-standard.
Correct.
And that also makes it easier for the applications to consume
Correct.
all of this because you're presenting them with a standardized service, as it were.
Yeah, and fundamentally still focusing from an on-premise and outward approach into Microsoft Azure services, AWS services.
Right. Well, thanks, Andrew. I really appreciate the insight. That sounds, it must be really interesting implementing and working on the stuff that you're describing here, because there's a lot of organizational work, there's a lot of detail work to make this go, but a lot of benefits.
Absolutely. It's a day-to-day challenge, and I think that from a hybrid identity standpoint, us as a community can build upon the foundation and where we see the services transitioning and going.
Thanks again, Andrew.
And you got it. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on the Hybrid Identity Protection Podcast with Sean Deuby. Be sure to subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you like to listen. Visit hipconf.com, that's HIPCONF.com, to learn about upcoming events, view expert presentations, and take part in the conversation.